Hey, this episode of This Is a Thing is actually part of Suptember 2022, where our theme has been about black superheroes and their effects and meanings in society. So definitely go and check out the other episode I did earlier this month on Luke Cage, as well as the episodes from last year's Suptember on The Punisher and Captain America. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss anything else we got going on, even after Suptember is over. And now, to the show. So Static Shock is a thing, and it's actually one of my favorite things in the entire world. I had watched the Batman animated series, and I still think that show is great, but the way that some people grew up with Batman as their hero because of that show was the same for me and Static. It's not like there's anything wrong with Batman, but Static's focus on a younger character with superpowers really resonated with me. I remember when Static Shock would air on Saturday mornings and after school on YTV, which is like Canada's version of Nickelodeon mixed with the WB, back when that was still a thing. But I remember being riveted by the action and animation, which admittedly has not aged super well, but it was the early 2000s and we were still watching things on CRT TVs. Anyway, this show was what got me into superheroes. I was awestruck by Static's abilities, so much so that shooting lightning is still the superpower I wish I had. I still often pretend to lightning bend when I think no one is watching.
Can you feel your own chi flowing in, down, up, and out?
Apart from being the reason for some of my strange habits, this show was also responsible for my interest in superheroes. It was from this show that I started to explore Spider-Man and even go back and really appreciate Batman the Animated Series. Even long after Static Shock was canceled, I could still feel its effects. I may not be a big fan of the current reign of superhero movies, but I'm definitely a huge fan of superheroes, their television shows, and more often than not, the animated ones. It's clear how important Static is to me, but this isn't just about me, despite This Is a Thing being my show. Because Static is actually a crucial and pivotal part of the story of superheroes, both in comics and as part of the moving picture. This has to do with Static Shock as a show and its inclusion in the DC animated universe, what Static did for viewers like me, and the story of Static's creation and creator. A big part of this was because Static was black, which is very important, and if you've been paying attention, the theme of Suptember 2022 has been black superheroes. And while a lot of this episode will have a bit more of a personal spin of my relationship with Static, I also want to reiterate that I have no experience as a person of color or as a sociologist, so this is about Static as a hero and Static Shock as a show and art form and the impact they had on comics, television, and superheroes as a whole. And so today, I want to talk about Static Shock. Just to clarify before we move on, Static is the name of the character and Static Shock is the name of the show. This is Static, and this is Static Shock. Everybody got that? Okay, good. Like Stan Lee and Spider-Man, Static is a hero that is inseparable from his creator, Dwayne McDuffie. As a young African-American, McDuffie was inspired by the comic book heroes of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, particularly Spider-Man and Black Panther. A highly educated young professional with a degree in physics, McDuffie chose to focus on the things that inspired him when he was a kid and made his living as a comic book writer, and eventually wound up working for Marvel. What struck McDuffie as a fan and writer of comics was that black superheroes at Marvel were rarely the titular characters, and they were often still marginalized and problematic. Black Panther was a bit of an exception. He was a prince, well-spoken, smart, athletic, and perceptive. He was, however, created by two Jewish dudes and was underutilized and appeared in problematic books and narratives. Apparently, at this time, McDuffie pitched a satirical series called the Teenage Blank Ninja Thrashers, with that blank being a word that is far too close to another word that starts with N, and I'm not comfortable saying either of them. The pitch was meant to be a scathing analysis of the way that Marvel was treating its black heroes at the time, and was definitely not meant to be taken seriously. Just look at this proposal. Night Thrasher is a decent name, but the rest of this thing is hilarious, and also very telling. Whether or not this was a factor in McDuffie's leaving or getting fired, I don't know. But after that, McDuffie found himself working as a freelance writer, where he worked for various different groups, including DC, Archie Comics, and Marvel, where he penned the story Damage Control, about the crew that cleans up after superhero battles. In the early 90s, McDuffie joined forces with Dennis Cowan, Michael Davies, and Dirk Dingle to create the single largest black-owned independent comic company ever, and called themselves Milestone Comics. The comics they created all focused on characters who were underrepresented, and in 1933 they launched 4 brand new series all starring people of color. These were Hardware, Blood Syndicate, Icon, and Static. The latter being the story of a young black man with the power of electricity. And if you're thinking, hey, that sounds like Black Lightning, that's because of something called the electric black guy trope, which is apparently an actual thing. All of these series were distributed by DC, but all of their rights were retained by Milestone, DC only having the right to refuse content they didn't agree with. These 4 series were followed up by even more heroes in comics, and while none of them ever reached the heights of Superman or Batman, their presence was felt, especially by African American fans. Warner Brothers had already had some success with their collaboration with DC in the Batman and Superman animated series, and Warner Brothers was willing to take some chances on their next superhero project. A few of Milestone's characters were in the running before Static was ultimately selected. The team consisted of most of the members from the Batman and Superman animated series, but with Milestone founder and Static co-creator Dennis Cohen helping with development. Because of the demographic the show was aimed at, a large number of changes were made to the story, including Static's age and the dynamics of his family and friends. However, most of the larger themes and narratives stayed mostly the same. Once the show was ready to begin production, McDuffie was brought on board as a story editor and writer. The show ran for 4 seasons and was one of the WB's most popular shows, but was ultimately cancelled, with many citing the older, outdated, blocky animation as the reason. However, Static the character was not abandoned, as it was clear that Dakota City was part of the DC animated universe through the various crossovers Static had had with Batman and the Justice League, so it was easy to have Static show up in other parts of the universe. He made a few cameos in Justice League Unlimited, along with one of my other favorite heroes, Jonah Hex. On the comic book side, Static was put on hiatus due to legal problems with the ownership of Milestone's IP, but the comic has since returned with some modern updates around the Black Lives Matter movement. More recently, Static appeared in a few episodes of the critically acclaimed Young Justice, and there are rumors circulating of a Static movie with Michael B. Jordan attached. It's unclear if he wants to play Static or produce or direct. I mean, I always see Static as younger, but I would not be mad at Michael B. Jordan. Not at all. Just in case you are now as obsessed with Static as me and Michael B. Jordan, and don't want his origin story ruined for you, this is your spoiler warning, as the show is pretty much the same as any of the other versions. Virgil Ovid Hawkins, wait, Virgil and Ovid. Oh, like the poets. I just got that. Virgil Ovid Hawkins is a young high schooler who lives with his father and sister in the fictional Dakota City in the United States. At 14, Virgil's life is pretty straightforward. He likes hanging with his friend Richie.
You know I got your back. Thanks, man. Peace and out.
Avoiding his bully Francis, and maybe asking his friend Frida to the dance.
I was kind of wondering if you would do me the honor. Snore.
The normal stuff. When Virgil's upperclassman Wade asks Virgil to join his crew so he doesn't have to constantly keep Francis at bay, Virgil balks. He appreciates the gesture, but his mother died due to gang violence, so Virgil plans to back out, just in time because Wade asks him to meet him down by the docks, where all the crews in the city are gonna throw down. Wade then hands Virgil a gun, but Virgil can't bring himself to be part of that kind of violence and throws it into the water. When the cops show up, all hell breaks loose. Some of the gangsters start firing at the cops, and so of course the police retaliate, which causes some hazardous materials to explode, releasing a gas called quantum juice, also known by its street name, Bang. Everyone at the docks, including Virgil, breathe in Bang, which causes strange mutations, turning them into metahumans, also known as Bang Babies. Virgil discovers that he has control over all things electrical, and he and Richie decide that he should use these powers to become the superhero called Static, cause
I put a shock to your system.
Unfortunately for Virgil/Static, he wasn't the only one to get abilities, as every person in the vicinity of the explosion, now known as the Big Bang, also have superpowers, and most of them are a lot less benevolent than Virgil. But with Richie on his side, and later at his side, Static is ready to face the world as a superhero. As I mentioned, some of the characters and themes were altered from the comic. Gang violence and themes of sex and drug abuse were toned way back. Richie's homosexuality became non-existent, and Virgil's parents were significantly altered, with his mother removed and his father basically a different character. Frida was now Virgil's love interest in the vein of Mary Jane or Lois Lane, and was replaced by Richie as Static's confidant because of Phil Lamar and Jason Marsden's chemistry. You might recognize their voices from another show from the same era called The Weekenders, in which they were also best friends. Static Shock as a show was a great addition to the Warner Brothers cartoon lineup, and was well liked, although the change in animation style from the Batman and Superman animated series was heavily criticized. However, the inclusion of Static into both the universe and the TV lineup made a huge impact, most notably because of the target demographic, which was a young preteen audience, but also because of the tone of the show and how it depicted a range of characters from different backgrounds and skin colors, and celebrated the differentiation of these characters, which set itself apart from the rest of the DC animated universe. Part of this is because Static Shock's characters use slang.
What the heck is up with that? You mean, what up with that? It Either use slang properly or don't use it at all.
This may seem cringy to us now, but I actually think that's largely the point, as Virgil and Static were 14 years old and trying to look cool. Of course they would attempt to emulate the vernacular of the celebrities at the time. Young people have always done this, and it regularly results in what the kids are now calling cringe. The music too was less atmospheric than Batman or heroic than Superman, opting instead for a sound that reflected the music that Virgil would have been listening to. The theme song was even sung and co-written by Lil Romeo, if anyone remembers who that is. But all of this culminated in a piece of art that was unique in its approach to storytelling, and people took notice, especially those in the animation industry, because Static Shock was unafraid of taking its story to new places that hadn't really been explored by superheroes in children's media. Batman, Superman, and the Justice League were all running at the same time, and Teen Titans would start a few years after Static Shock started. And they were all amazing, but they all focused on narratives about their characters and villains as they fought. Static did this too, but it was more often about the real-world issues that plagued high school youth, and especially black youth. There's an award-winning episode of Static Shock called Jimmy, where Virgil and Richie meet a kid named Jimmy who is bullied relentlessly until one day he brings a gun to school with the intention of harming or humiliating his assailants, but accidentally shoots Richie. This episode features Virgil talking to a therapist about his grief as both Static and himself for not preventing the incident, both with his powers and with his capacity for empathy. It was these kinds of stories that made Static different to other shows, and it was what the future of superhero shows would become. This episode was actually penned by Mcduffie, and after Static Shock was cancelled, Mcduffie was brought on to the new series Justice League Unlimited, where the heroes and stories were revivified with more personal narratives in order to bring new life into the show. This approach to storytelling would also reach far out into the future to shows Mcduffie had no connection to, like the incomparable, spectacular Spider-Man. On a more personal level, Static Shock was a huge game changer for me. As I mentioned, this was the show that got me into the idea of superheroes. I think it's worth noting this because Static is black and I'm not, and for a long time I didn't even really think about why this was important, and it really is. But I didn't realize or care because there were other factors at play in the show. Virgil's age was much younger than the other heroes of the time, and the problems he came up against were often the same kinds of things that all kids deal with. What made Virgil so cool was his powers, his superhero alter ego, and quick wit.
Static's an old guy.
Hey, I'm almost old enough to drive.
Yep, Static.
But what made Virgil so likable was the fact that underneath the mask, he was still a high school kid. His abilities might have allowed him to defeat supervillains, but they didn't make his day-to-day problems disappear. Now I know I'm privileged enough not to have to deal with the problems of gangs and gun violence, but being bullied, hormones, parents, friends, crushes, siblings, these are all things I did and do know about, and Virgil isn't a brilliant billionaire who's smooth or cool with the ladies. He just stumbles his way through things like everyone else. He had to learn how to be himself and get by like the rest of us, and once I empathized with him on that level, then I could understand his stakes and feelings when the show went to places that I had the privilege of never being a part of. I liked Static and Virgil because he was like me. He made mistakes and had normal problems that he couldn't just snap his fingers and solve. These are all the same reasons why I did an episode of This Is a Thing on the Spectacular Spider-Man for being the best version of Spider-Man. Static Shock was very much inspired by Spider-Man, and a lot of his story mimics Peter Parker's, except he's black. And yes, I know Miles Morales is a thing, and I love him, but I'm talking about Static. I never really thought about Static being black when I was growing up. The color of his skin never had any impact on my decision for why he was the coolest. Whereas Mcduffie and others had to purposefully seek out heroes who looked like them while growing up, I was in a position where there were tons of white superheroes who looked like me. But Static came along at the right time for me, and it didn't matter what he looked like because he was what I wanted to be like. I still want to be like him. He was just someone to look up to. He felt like a peer or a friend trying to make his way in the world, just like any kid does. And that made him more of a hero to me than Batman or Superman ever could have been. People often argue about why representation matters, and some say they don't want it in their media, which I find alarming for a number of reasons. But for someone like me who's very much visibly part of the hegemonic majority in Western culture, and in a lot more ways than just my skin color, there are already so many characters that are like me in all kinds of media. But for those who are othered for their skin color, culture, background, sexual orientation, or a multitude of other factors, they may not see themselves reflected in the characters, and therefore have no heroes to look up to. So making characters like Static that are different to the norm but are still relatable allows people to find a piece of themselves in the character and the media. I know that my privilege is also what afforded me the option to choose Static. I'm under no illusions about what choices I had available to me in terms of selecting my hero, but I still chose Static. Mcduffie made Static a likable and real character that drew me and many others in because he was a great hero and a great person. Mcduffie carried on the legacy of Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, who had inspired him with Spider-Man and Black Panther. McDuffie has a legacy in his own right, though, one that is exceedingly important. After Milestone was dissolved, their intellectual property and characters were left a little up in the air in terms of who they belonged to and how they would fit into the DC universe going forward. That means that Static and many of his peers have been able to continue on with the cameos I mentioned in Young Justice, but for a long time were never really given a home within that universe or their own. After finishing with Static Shock, McDuffie moved on to shape many more shows. I already mentioned Justice League Unlimited, where he was directly involved in 69 of the 91 episode run. He then went on to work on Teen Titans and What's New Scooby-Doo. McDuffie was then tapped for the sequel series of the hugely popular Ben 10 in Ben 10 Alien Force, helping to reshape that show into a more mature version of the original. He continued on with the second sequel series, Ben 10 Ultimate Alien. He then left the animation industry and returned to comic books, where he worked with both DC and Marvel again. During his return to comic book writing, McDuffie penned a 2-part series called Milestone Forever, which followed an event that forever meshed those characters into the continuity of the larger DC universe. Later, McDuffie would partially return to animation by writing several Justice League movies that sparked the resurgence in DC's animation, with Crisis on Two Earths and Justice League Doom. Unfortunately, McDuffie passed away in 2011 at the age of 49 due to heart failure. But the impact that he had was huge, not just on the shows he worked on, but on the entirety of the animation industry, superheroes, and specifically heroes of color. The creation of Static and other Milestone comic book characters probably saved the comic industry in regards to how stories could be told, and McDuffie and his peers knew that they couldn't just create one hero, because then that character would be seen as a representation of all black superheroes. So they went about creating 4 series to start, and that was only the beginning. These characters and the creators behind them, including McDuffie, made it possible for comics to tell stories about people of color with nuance, without stereotype. But it didn't end there, because McDuffie then moved to the animation industry, where once again his understanding of narrative and people of color revitalized the animation industry, starting with Static and continuing to the present, where we still feel the effects of his and Static's game-changing narratives. They say not all heroes wear capes, and while Static's look is iconic with the coat and glasses, and he's often used as the face of McDuffie's work, in a lot of ways it's McDuffie and others like him that are the real heroes. Heroes who create narratives that speak to people of all ages and backgrounds. Static Shock, Static the character, and McDuffie changed the superhero game in 2 different mediums, through the way Static was handled, the way Static as a character affected so many people, and how McDuffie understood that realistic heroes could be used to tell real stories about real people. And so with this Suptember being the exact 22-year anniversary of Static Shock's first airing, I felt like it was important to talk about the character that is still my favorite superhero, and one of the people that created him. So for inspiring one young white kid from Canada with the most badass superhero ever, thank you Milestone, Static, and Dwayne McDuffie for what you did for the industry, and for what you did for me personally. And that is why Static is my favorite superhero, and why he and his creator saved and changed superheroes forever. Here are my stray thoughts. Static may be my favorite character, but the other Milestone heroes, Icon and Hardware, have also been influential in their own right. I know that there was some controversy about who owns Static, and that's why the character hasn't been around for a while, but that wasn't the point I wanted to make. Now that it's over, I know we have a new comic, and I'm hoping we can get a show, or maybe that movie finally. Hey! Thanks so much for watching that episode. I really enjoy Static. He's one of my favorites. And that's the end of Suptember 2022. We'll see if we come back next year for another one, but the schedule is going to change up a little bit. I'm going to be focusing more on This Is a Thing and making sure that is the priority, and everything else can go take a back seat so that I can focus on these essays, because I think that's what people really come for. That's where all the numbers are showing me. Stick around for that. Don't forget to zap that like button and subscribe so you'll never miss another episode of This Is a Thing, right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.